Thank you for joining us today. As previously asked to create a just transition plan, our team has created a proposal to manage your allocated funds. We have created an investment philosophy to understand a just transition, created a screening methodology, crafted proposed portfolio, assessed the current portfolio, and then managed through transition roadmap, monitoring, and rebalancing. Keeping in mind the characteristics that you would set for us as an institution with $10 million, a medium risk tolerance, high growth orientation, long-term investment of at least 15 years, and evolving customer expectations, we've made the assumption that you are in favor of a just transition to a net zero economy. As SCD, we recognize the necessity of a net zero economy and understand our unique role to financially support the advancement of this transition in a just manner. However, there are limits to the portfolio that we have listed below for future reference. Our investment philosophy has the goal of building a fair, inclusive, and sustainable future through value creation. We have set 4 themes, which include understanding your needs, goals, and objectives through a shareholder assessment, just creation through thematic and positive processes, crafting a justifiable proposed portfolio that meets your needs while being inclusive of a just transition, while managing and monitoring the portfolio in alignment with your needs while rebalancing at periodic time intervals. When speaking to a net zero economy, the aim is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions linked to devastating climate and social impacts. We have defined a net zero economy as achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 while making the economy more resilient, inclusive, and competitive. Given the majority of your portfolio is invested in Canadian products, we look to align our philosophy with Canada's targets for the Paris Agreement to reduce global mean temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which requires reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 45% of 2005 levels. The importance of this shift is becoming increasingly more important as we see climate-related impacts such as severe flooding and social impacts such as crop failure becoming more common. Knowing the requirements of a net zero economy to reduce the frequency and severity of climate-related and social impacts, a just transition is required to promote equity among all stakeholders for this net zero economy. We have defined a just transition as maximizing net zero economies in a way that is fair and inclusive for everyone and accelerates ambitious climate action. Based on supporting documentation from the United Nations Committee for Development Policy in 2023, the International Labour Organization, and Canada's Sustainable Job Plan. Canada has created the Sustainable Jobs Act to support the transition to ensure a net zero economy is equitable for all stakeholders. According to the World Benchmarking Alliance's Just Transition methodology, the 4 key stakeholder groups are workers, which includes full, part-time, and contract workers, affected stakeholders, some of which include communities that will be impacted as a result, business relationships, including both upstream and downstream relationships, and vulnerable groups, which is the most extensive group, with key groups being elderly persons, Indigenous peoples, and youth. Now I'll pass it over to Dina to speak to you about our methodology and facilitate the links for a just transition towards a net zero economy.
Thanks, Alyssa. Our team developed equity and bond-specific screening methodologies. First, we'll walk through the 2 phases of the equity methodology, starting with the thematic screening focused on just transition and net zero targeted industries. Our second round of screening focused on metrics that supported the 2 overarching themes of the proposed portfolio. The current portfolio acted as a guide for where and what to invest in. We found a strong correlation between the current portfolio industries and those that will face a significant challenge moving forward towards a net zero economy. The current portfolio's geographic exposure is approximately 60% Canadian, 40% international, with 30% being based in the US. The industries that the proposed portfolio will align with are similar to those of the current portfolio. The overlap is located in energy, agriculture, industry, and infrastructure, among others. From this research, that we found that these are industries that have the most important opportunities to shift towards a net zero economy. The proposed portfolio will be selected based on these industries. The second phase of our screening looks at just transition, net zero, and ESG specific metrics. Due to the overarching themes of just transition and net zero, both were equally weighted at 40% for our scorecard, and with the remaining 20% allocated to governance. Based on our research, the World Benchmarking Alliance Just Transition Indicators identified clear metrics of how to support a just transition. However, to account for the newer standards of how to create an economically viable future, we further supported our research with a social score from Refinitiv. We'll discuss a further breakdown in a moment. The environment in net zero weight is represented by carbon intensity, implied temperature rise, and Refinitiv's environmental score. For governance, Refinitiv's governance score was used based on the metrics of ESG reporting and transparency, organization structure and compensation management, and shareholder management and proxy voting. Higher governance scoring is correlated with high performance of the remaining E and S categories of ES and G.
Thank you, Dina. So to screen for suitable bonds, we'll build off the same investment philosophy that we utilize to develop our equity screening methodology. This will ensure alignment with the client's overall climate, societal risk, and return expectations. Since the fixed income assets are fundamentally different, neither stage will be identical to the steps we took to screen for equities. In the first step, we'll apply thematic screening to obtain ETFs denominated in Canadian dollars, while at least 70% of the exposure focused on Canada. The second step integrates the client's sustainability-related goals by screening the remaining assets to filter out any that don't demonstrate ESG as a core part of their strategy. Here's a table summarizing the screening process to narrow the universe of assets that provide exposure to bonds. We screen for ETFs for their liquidity, simplicity, cost, and diversification. Our Canada and ESG-focused approach aims to meet portfolio restrictions and manage foreign exchange, geographic, and sustainability risks. The cash in the portfolio, which is 5%, won't change, but it'll be allocated towards RBC high-interest e-savings account. The rapidly evolving sustainability and financial landscape will provide attractive opportunities to capitalize on. So having cash ready to deploy helps us achieve flexibility while maintaining alignment with our rebalancing guidelines. The investment vehicle also manages interest rate risk, default risk, and overall portfolio volatility. For future considerations, adjusting the percentage cash in the portfolio could be more optimal depending on macroeconomic and regulatory conditions. Since we've covered our investment approach for the three asset classes, I want to take a step back and assess the current portfolio's notional alignment. The slide shows carbon intensity for the three holdings in the existing portfolio. Since this is being used as a benchmark for the proposed portfolio, we can't assess the current portfolio's alignment to net zero using this. However, we know the target for the total portfolio's temperature rise in the midterm is 1.5 degrees Celsius, but here it shows that it's 2.31 degrees. So it shows it's not aligned with net zero targets. Furthermore, the client's portfolio hasn't signaled any just transition alignment. So now I'll pass it on to Deep, who will discuss measuring and monitoring the proposed portfolio.
Thanks, Pura. Now I'll be talking about targeting and measurement of some of our portfolio objectives. So we'll be starting by following the United Nations Net Zero Alliance of Asset Owners target setting protocol, and that relies on three overarching themes that we have discussed so far. So the first one is the net zero targets of achieving 25% absolute emission reductions by 2025 and then 50% by 2030. The second theme is measuring and targeting just transition targets, and we'll be doing that by measuring the engagement targets of achieving 65% engagement by 2030 and then 80% engagement by 2035. And we'll be mainly doing this by looking at documentation and policy of the proposed companies, and that will be measured by the Refinitiv score that we introduced earlier. And lastly, we will be looking at the financial targets of having Sharpe ratio greater than 1 and nominal return greater than 8%. Next, we will look at the performance of the current portfolio mix and then compare it with the proposed portfolio mix. So the current portfolio mix is 30% Canadian equity and 30% Canadian fixed income and about 40% global equity. And if you look at the 5-year performance of the current portfolio, the annualized return is just under 9% with a standard deviation of 12.5%. And then Sharpe ratio of 0.73 and Sortino ratio of 0.5. In terms of proposed portfolio mix, the spread is almost similar to the current portfolio. We have about 30% Canadian equity, 40% global equity, and of that 30% is US, and then 10% is other global equities. Fixed income is 25%, and then cash is 5%. The expected performance of current portfolio is about just under 11% of annualized return with standard deviation of 13.9%, and then improvement on Sharpe and Sortino ratio when compared to the performance of the current portfolio. Next, we'll also keep in mind that we'll be charging a management fee of about 0.5% to ensure protective fund management and budget allocation for portfolio governance and making sure that the portfolio is aligned with the theme. In terms of proposed products, we have selected Canadian equities of 30% as mentioned based on the different sectors that we had introduced in our initial screening. And then same goes with the US equities as US and global equities as well. Lastly, for fixed income investments, we have fixed income bond ETFs, one of them from National Bank and then two from BlackRock that aligns with the investment themes that we have discussed so far. Now I'll pass on to Lucy to talk about the just transition journey.
Thanks, Deep. Our current portfolio's implied temperature rise will be limited to 1.3 degrees Celsius, and our absolute emission is projected to be reduced by 50% to 439 metric tons of CO2e, which achieves our current portfolio's net zero targets by 2030. As well as our total portfolio's weighted carbon intensity is projected at 56.2 metric tons CO2e per million revenue earned, which is a 300% reduction improvement from our current portfolio of 226 metric CO2e per million revenue earned. To complement our methodology and portfolio, there must be stringent risk management practices in place. As for our financial risks, we have first identified foreign exchange, interest rate, and inflation risk, which can be combated through hedging strategies and inclusion of quality indexes and ETFs with readily available macroeconomic trends to enhance our portfolio's breadth and depth. Liquidity risk can be tackled by including mid to large market cap stocks, which include volume-based liquidity measures. And this enables a just portfolio management with adaptability, which is crucial on navigating through the current high volatile market condition. And lastly, credit risk, which can be mitigated through in-depth due diligence review, as well as hedging strategies such as CDS, asset diversification, and credit restructure. Other than the financial risks, there are a few non-financial measures that we must consider and deploy. By reviewing and enhancing our portfolio's net zero and just transition targets on the go, we're able to combat the evolving environment of policies and regulations. Environmental risks are important to consider as well, as it consists both the physical and the transition risks. The sector-specific and geographic-specific targets must be established to consider the culture and the resource differences. And lastly, we must promote active stewardship within the portfolio companies and funds with assurance of compliance and proxy voting. Proper portfolio governance will ensure that we can tackle all prior risks on a strategic portfolio level. Active maintenance and oversight are essential to ensure the longevity of our portfolio's health and to track and achieve our net zero and just transition targets. Strategic asset allocation allows us to adjust our allocation mix depending on the current market, financial performance and conditions, as well as the regulatory landscape. For instance, if we believe the fixed income assets will have a strong growth with moderate risk level, then we can adjust this up to 40%, as well as potential investments such as REIT, which if it meets our future clients' needs and goals, we can adjust allocation spanning from 10 to 20%. Additionally, we'll undergo portfolio rebalancing on an annual basis, which allows us to review our portfolio strategies and targets holistically and proactively. Lastly, we intend to assess and review our current methodology through benchmarking against industry best practices and ESG leading frameworks to adjust to the success and the failure of our investment. Supplemented with commitment to net zero asset owner alliances, as well as consistent transparency reporting, we will be proactively monitoring our engagement targets through proxy voting, as well as Refinitiv social governance score and appropriate weighing of the ESG scorecard scoring over time. Thanks for listening.